Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to Filmsplaining. I'm your host, Martyn Strange. If you can't already tell by all of my swag, I have just returned from the Sundance Film Festival in Park City, Utah. I had a pretty great time on this trip. Park City is a beautiful place. Utah in general is a beautiful place. I took lots of videos and photos of the mountains and the snow and just the kind of majesty of the landscape that I personally am not used to seeing where I'm at in East Tennessee. Our mountains are very hilly and densely populated with trees, and these mountains are very spread out, and it's a huge horizon and you can see everything. So I was having a great time just kind of taking all of that in. And as for the festival itself, I generally had a pretty okay time. There was this air around the festival for most of it that was a kind of melancholy, this being the last year in Park City, Utah, the place that Sundance has called home for over 40 years. I spoke with many people who are not that enthused or excited about the festival moving to Boulder, Colorado next year, and many folks are not really planning on attending that festival. I myself am probably not going to attend because I learned the lesson the hard way that I am not a good person to go to film festivals in the wintertime. It was very cold in Park City. There was a little bit of weather, not much snow, a kind of dusting. It wasn't really sticking to the roads or anything, but it was very cold, and I was doing a lot of walking and actually injured my knee while I was out there, which is possibly due to the altitude or the cold or just the fact that I was walking miles and miles every day, which is funny considering that all of my screenings took place in one single theater because I only did press screenings this time around. I did not go to any premieres or any midnight showings or anything that was playing basically after around 6 or 7 p.m. Because I was actually staying in Salt Lake City. And so I Ubered back and forth to the festival every day. And when I arrived at the press building where I was to pick up my pass, I went and got my pass. I checked out the press office a little bit. They had a pretty decent space for people to sit around and work and chat and have meetings. But I was not aware at the time that my personal press pass was different than most of the members of the press at this festival. And I found this out by going to my very first screening on my first day and was informed that after I waited in the press line to get into this screening and tried to go into the theater, they told me that my pass was designated specifically for a 5-minute line, or what they called the fiver line. This means that I only got to go into a movie 5 minutes ahead of showtime if there were still seats available. And so this threw a major wrench in my plans as far as what I wanted to see, what I had planned on seeing at the festival. And this was not clearly communicated to me by the folks at Sundance, and it put a damper on things for sure. So many of the films that I'm going to be talking about in this video, I did not even plan on seeing. Most of them I did not know much about. I did, however, get into a handful of things that were on my list, that were on my radar, which of course I'll talk about. But the very first film I saw on that day, which was the day that I thought that I was getting booted out of the screening, I did end up being able to attend that screening, was a documentary called The Disciple. This is directed by Joanna Natasagara. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It is this freewheeling, kind of very energetic documentary about the Wu-Tang Clan, but specifically about a character who was kind of at the center of the group for an amount of time in the late 90s to early 2000s, a rapper and DJ and producer by the name of Silver Rings. He's a Dutch Moroccan rapper, and he basically insinuated himself into the kind of crew, the Wu-Tang extended network. They called them affiliates, actually, in this documentary. But he was able to do this by traveling to New York at a young age and just going to their offices repeatedly, running into people who worked with them, trying to submit his demos, and through this wild series of events, eventually ended up meeting the RZA and other members of the Wu-Tang Clan, kind of showed off his skills and showed his dedication to the group and what they were trying to accomplish. He ended up touring with them. He ended up promoting tours for them. It's a really fascinating documentary because basically the The climax of the film is surrounding the misbegotten attempts to release the Wu-Tang Clan's final album, Once Upon a Time in Shaolin. If you remember, several years ago, this was a huge topic in the news because Silver Rings, this rapper and producer, basically masterminded the idea of releasing this album as a sole one-copy album. Their whole goal with it was to try and elevate hip-hop music to the status of contemporary art. And so there was this huge auction and bidding war over who would ultimately own this single copy of the album. And if you remember, if you were paying attention to the news back then, it was sold to Martyn, the disgraced big pharma guy who basically committed a series of fraud and was eventually imprisoned. And this documentary deals with the fallout of that whole experiment and how it basically tanked Silver Rings' career. He says at one point he had no career to begin with, although all of the evidence could prove contrary to that. But I think it was a really interesting film to kind of kick off the festival. There's a lot of really good black and white photography in this with splashes of color. Most of the Wu-Tang Clan did not really seem to want to give new interviews. There are a few members and a few affiliates who are interviewed in the process, but it was a pretty decent movie to start off my Sundance experience with. For the next film, I was trying to get in to see the body horror movie Saccharine, but once again, due to my pass, I was not let into that movie because it was full. So I saw a film called The Incomer, which turned out to be actually one of my favorites of the festival. It's a comedy from Scotland, starring Gail Rankin and Donald Gleeson, which is this really fun, like kind of satirical black comedy about these two siblings who live on this deserted Scottish island. And Donald Gleeson shows up as this kind of mediator who is forced to give them the bad news that they must leave the premises. He's evicting them, essentially. I just thought this was a really fun, kind of heartfelt comedy. Donald Gleeson gives a hilarious performance. Gail Rankin gives a great performance. If you don't know her, she was on Glow and has been in a number of indie horror films and other things recently. It's kind of about how modernity eventually comes for us all. And it's also about found family. Donald Gleeson's character starts getting very close to this brother and sister. There's a romantic tension boiling between him and Gail Rankin's character. Along with this, there's an element of like weird supernatural folklore because one of the things that the siblings do to entertain themselves is tell each other these old folk tales. And there are all these things about fishmen. They call them fin men. Even one appears physically in the film. You know, it's a lot about their ancestral history and how their family has lived on this island for centuries, and they have always maintained this like very simple quality of life where they don't have the internet, they don't have smartphones, they live off of the land, but the land is proving more inhospitable, and so they're running out of things to eat and cook. But I just thought it was a really fun, interesting, like twisted blend of things like The Lighthouse or Swiss Army Man or The Banshees of Inisherin. There are all these like kind of seaside, fun, quirky little comedies that come to mind when you're watching this movie, and it proved to be one of my favorites at the festival. The next thing I watched, once again because I could not get into a screening of what I wanted to see, was a movie called Philipinana. This is directed by Rafael Manuel, and it's really more of this kind of collage of isolated incidents than a straight narrative feature. It follows basically a day in the life of a group of young women who work at a fancy golf resort in Manila in the Philippines, and they are what's known as tea girls or caddies for these golfers. And it's a very, very slow movie. And if you see it, you'll know what I mean, because there are shots that literally linger for minutes and minutes. Very little dialogue throughout. There is a kind of sinister undercurrent to what is going on, but that is not ultimately revealed or even hinted at until like the last 30 minutes of the movie, which, you know, by the time you've watched over an hour of this very slow moving, but I will say very beautifully realized world. The photography is gorgeous in this film, but it's just about these characters who are like quietly, stoically moving through their day. And then you get this kind of sinister revelation towards the end of it about what has possibly been really going on, and you learn more about the proprietor of this golf resort. It's an incredibly weird zag for this movie to make towards the end, and then as you are watching the credits roll, there are even more scenes that are still happening and there's more revealed. Ultimately, this movie did not really work for me. I found it kind of a punishing experience because of the slow nature of it, and I really just didn't feel like the undertone of what this film is going for was totally earned by the end of its runtime. But again, it was very gorgeous to look at. It is a movie that has something to say. I just wish it had kind of started saying it sooner in the runtime and more clearly communicated and telegraphed what it was going for earlier on. The next movie I watched was Paralyzed by Hope, the Maria Bamford story. This is a documentary directed by Judd Apatow, and it basically chronicles Maria Bamford's life. If you know Maria Bamford, if you know her comedy, you know she's a very particular, unique, curious, and kind of kooky presence in the comedy world. I have been a big fan of Maria Bamford's for many years. I really love the way she interacts with the world and her impressions, especially of her family members. She just has a very specific, unique, dialed-in, weird comedic tone, and if you are a fan of that, then you will enjoy this documentary because there's tons of footage from her earliest days as a stand-up up until now, and you really get to see a glimpse into how she formed her comedic personality, how she honed her craft over the years, eventually finding like-minded comedians with the comedians of comedy. Many of her friends and colleagues are in this documentary being interviewed about her. It obviously opens up a whole world about her struggles with her own mental health, which, again, if you're a fan of Maria Bamford, you probably know a lot of by now. She's been very open and honest in the news and in the press about her struggles with intrusive thoughts and OCD and depression. You even see her and her husband dealing with the fallout of the LA fires. She lives in Altadena, and her family were directly affected by those fires, and you see kind of where she has moved to at this point in her life after losing her parents. She's doing community theater and very small like pop-up gigs in Altadena where she lives. Conan O'Brien makes a hilarious funny bit about how she her anxiety started the fires. So there's just lots of really fun, good stuff to chew on in this documentary, even if it is extremely standardized and very kind of like by the numbers, by the books presentation of this person's life. But I did find it pretty delightful. The next day, I actually got into all the films that I wanted to see. So I started with the new film from Greg Araki called I Want Your Sex. Stars Cooper Hoffman, Olivia Wilde, Charlie XCX, and Mason Gooding. This was the closest I actually sat to the screen. I was in the second row, so I was like inches away from the screen. So you would think that experience would kind of like potentially ruin my viewing of the film, but it was actually one of my best viewing experiences because this movie really played in the audience that I was with. I found it very funny. Much of the audience was laughing all throughout the movie. It's a Greg Araki movie, so it's dealing with kind of absurd, surreal elements, but also a very real portrait of what our modern society's relationship to sex has become. Specifically, he seems very interested in aiming this movie directly at Gen Z and their purported lack of sex positivity and needing to feel safe and feel okay. There's a lot about consent in this movie. There's a lot about inappropriate workplace relationships. Olivia Wilde plays this wildly successful artist. Cooper Hoffman is her intern and assistant. They begin this torrid sexual affair wherein he is subjugated to all kinds of kinks, and he is a submissive to her dom. And I just thought this was a really fun movie. I saw a lot of people saying it was very tame. And yeah, if you're considering Greg Araki's early work, especially the first 3 or 4 movies, I covered his Apocalypse trilogy, Teen Apocalypse trilogy on my podcast last year. It is a little tamer, but he's still showing you a lot of stuff. It does not really blink or shy away from, especially showing the kind of absurdity of these sort of sexual games that these people are playing with each other. I think it's a really funny observation to intentionally desexualize Charlie XCX in this movie, who is a sex icon. And, the soundtrack is very important. Obviously, with Iraqi, he's always using music to further highlight his point. This film doesn't use the kind of like shoegaze and industrial music that his earlier work does. So it's a lot more like kind of electro pop music. There is a kind of running interrogation sequence that's happening in this movie that I found kind of like really slowed the energy of the film. It kind of like stops it in its tracks a few times, although the police interrogators are played by Johnny Knoxville and Margaret Cho, so that was kind of fun to see. But yeah, all of the Greg Araki trademarks are here. It does look a little too polished. It looks kind of like an Apple movie or maybe an A24 movie. I'm not sure who this will ultimately get sold to, but I had a really fun time with it, and I'm excited for more people to see I Want Your Sex. The next thing I watched was a documentary called They Dream. This is directed, edited, and starring a guy named William D. Caballero, and it's a film that is basically about his life and about his family life. It's combining decades worth of archival footage and interviews with his family, and the presentation of it is that it's combining all of these elements of animation. Basically every animation technique under the sun you can imagine, it appears in this movie in some way. There is stop motion, there are handmade sculptures and puppets. There's 2D animation. There's rotoscoping. William Caballero is obviously a very gifted, like visual storyteller in the way that he is combining all of these elements. And you even see his process in the documentary. He's showing you every step of the process and how he's making the movie. But the movie itself, I have to say, just did not really work for me. It is all about grief and loss and charting his family's struggles with being able to sort of try and rise above their low middle class status. And the whole piece basically has this somber air of grief. And I just found it really to be kind of trauma porn for the most part. It's a very ambitious movie. He's iterating on these short films that he made for HBO some years ago. And some of that is even in the documentary as well. But I really felt like there's just no objectivity here. It's completely from one person's point of view, and my personal taste in documentaries is just not aligned with that whatsoever. So the audience watching this movie has no room to interpret their own meaning to what they're seeing on screen. I do think it's a very inventive and unique movie. It's admirable, the things that he's doing with this animation itself, but it's just an unbearably sad film and very saccharine, very sentimental. I don't know. I think this guy should maybe just try and go to therapy next time. The next thing I saw was one of my most anticipated movies of the festival. It is The Moment, directed by Aiden Zamiri. This is the mockumentary / tour documentary / meta-textual film starring and about Charlie XCX. It also stars Alexander Skarsgård, Haley Benton Gates, and Rosanna Arquette. This is a very sly satirical movie, basically about the whirlwind life of a modern pop star. I personally am a big fan of Charlie XCX, both as a pop star and as a kind of modern cult of personality. She has done a lot of goodwill towards movies and filmmaking and spotlighting independent film and foreign film. Her Letterboxd account is dynamite. It's hilarious to read some of her reviews. If you've not checked that out, just go take a look at it. She also does TikTok reviews of films. But really, this movie is about capturing that moment of Brat and of Brat Summer and this kind of catapulting from, Charlie XCX was a well-known star before Brat, but that album and that tour really took her to a completely new level that she had never seen before and honestly was not very prepared for. And this movie is about trying to keep some sense of yourself and some sense of your artistic integrity when you're literally like doing brand deals for condom flavors and making special credit cards for your fans to buy your tickets to your show. It's like this knife's edge of tones between pure hilarity and absurdity and also a very heartfelt, very dramatic portrait of what it's like to be someone on this precipice of fame and fortune. I think this was a really effective movie. A lot of people I've seen so far have said that it is very like meandering and kind of unfocused and doesn't really have much to say, but I actually think all of those things about it are kind of working in its favor, and kind of broader, encapsulation of Charlie's aesthetics, and particularly of the kind of whirlwind nature of what that album did for her, and how she is now kind of having to make these choices between selling out and remaining true to herself. Alexander Skarsgård just gives a knockout performance as this director who comes in to direct her concert film, and he does his best to destroy basically everything that is cool about her, both as a performer and a personality. I think it's a really fun movie. In a few words, it's Brat, and it's completely different, but it is also still Brat. The next thing I watched was another documentary. I got a lot of documentaries at this festival simply because I was turned away from a lot of the narrative features that I wanted to see. But this documentary is called Soul Patrol. It's directed by J.M. Harper. It is about one of the first, if not the first, black GI groups who served in Vietnam behind enemy lines. There is a lot of contrived reenactments in this movie that I just really don't vibe with. I think it's a kind of a trap that modern documentaries seem to find themselves in. But luckily, those are kind of sparsed throughout the film, and most of what we see is real footage shot by these soldiers in Vietnam when they were there, combined with newer interviews. This team, what is left of them, have come together over 50 years after they were first together in Vietnam. They were forced to serve due to the draft, and the documentary really focuses a lot on how they felt they were leaving the troubles that were happening in this country at the same time with civil rights and the Black Panther movement and all of these things, that they felt like the real war was at home, yet they were being shipped off to serve in this pointless, senseless war. As we now know, everything that happened in Vietnam was pretty much a disaster. This group is a reconnaissance team. They're sent deep into the desolate jungles of Saigon, and it's just one of many stories like this, and one of many stories that are just now kind of being told, and because they're now being allowed to tell their stories. They were told never basically to talk about this to anyone, and the central figure at the center of the film, Ed Emanuel, who wrote the book that this film is based on, did finally tell his story. I found a lot of inspiration here for Spike Lee's To Five Bloods. If you've seen that movie, you'll know exactly, like, if he didn't pull from this specific story, he was definitely reading a lot about similar stories here, because you could almost make a one-to-one comparison about the struggles and chaos and horror that these men went through in Vietnam with that film, which of course is fictionalized. But they are gathering together, they are remembering these things, they're talking about things that they haven't spoken about in years and years. They're reminiscing about the good times they had, just hanging out and listening to music and smoking at the barracks. And then they're reminiscing about the horrors they experienced, and sharing very openly about how the war kind of never really ended, and they have spent their entire lives dealing with this trauma of Vietnam. There's a section where the documentary talks to their wives, and these women are telling their stories of having to live with this and supporting their husbands through these struggles that they go through every single day. I found that this was a very moving documentary. Again, I wish it kind of didn't intentionally create these like recreations of what happened with actors and stuff. There's a very weird sequence where Ed Emanuel is walking through a grocery store, and he's seeing, the young soldiers as they were back then. They're like patrolling the grocery store. I'm not sure why that happened, but I think this is a very important story. It's a very moving documentary. It ends with a beautiful, haunting needle drop. Yeah, sadly, during the process of filming this, many of these veterans have passed away, but you get to see them talk about these stories for the first time, and in a very public forum. So it was a very moving film. Next thing I saw was a movie called Union County. This is directed by a guy called Adam Meeks. It stars Will Poulter, Noah Centineo, Elise Kibler, Emily Mead, and a host of non-actors, because this movie is a very quiet drama that is really laser focused on this kind of raw naturalism, focusing on people and places in rural Ohio, and many real life people, real life addicts, are playing themselves or playing versions of themselves. It's about a recovery program for addicts, and it was shot with the participation of the adult recovery court of the director's hometown. Actually, he's basically telling a story about the people in his hometown. And Will Poulter's character, Cody, is kind of new to this group. He's new to the whole process of recovery. He gets pulled back into it by his cousin, played by Noah Centineo. And it's a very, very quiet movie, very measured performances. I do think Will Poulter is pretty good in this. You know, he's a former drug user. He's hoping to beat his addictions and re-enter society in a better way. And recovery, as anyone who has ever been an addict or knows an addict knows, is a lifelong process. And you see the kind of rise and fall of these characters throughout the film. And his foster brother, Jack, turns out to be a bad influence, and they both relapse. You know, it's a very important theme, and one that has obviously been explored on film before. My one hiccup with this movie is that we don't really get to start to develop empathy for these characters until about midway through the film, because the whole first part of it is just kind of focusing on the relapses, and we just don't see Cody making an effort for a very long time. Again, with a kind of very naturalistic, raw performances, the non-actors. It almost plays like a documentary for the first half of it, and then we actually finally get some sort of conflict and engine to the story. But it's a localized story, but it obviously deals with universal themes and feelings. The filmmaking is very subtle. It matches the content of the movie. The camera is very restrained. This is not an exciting or energetic movie by any means, but I did think it had great performances. It did strain my attention a little bit throughout, but there is a satisfying conclusion ultimately to Union County. The next thing I saw, which turned out to be my favorite film of the festival, is a movie called The Wait. This is directed by Pyrek McKinley. I believe Pyrek is the way you pronounce it. It stars Ethan Hawke, Russell Crowe, Julia Jones, and Austin Emilio. This is a debut feature from this director, and I was really impressed with this movie. It is stirring. It's a bleak and brutal thriller that basically follows a group of convicts who are trying to get parole through the wilderness of Eugene, Oregon, on this very dangerous mission in the midst of the Great Depression. Basically, Sam, Ethan Hawke's character, mistakenly punches a police officer when he's trying to protect and defend his daughter, and is taken to this prison camp where they are building roads, basically breaking big rocks into smaller rocks. And his boss, who's played by Russell Crowe, the warden of the prison camp, offers him amnesty and the chance to reunite with his daughter if he will basically transport a bunch of stolen government gold from the mines in the hills back to the camp. Basically what follows is like, what if Sorcerer, William Friedkin's film, were set in the 1930s in the midst of the Great Depression in the Pacific Northwest, and only instead of carrying nitroglycerin, they are carrying stolen gold. And this gold is being taken basically before FDR can seize all of the mine's assets for the federal government. Obviously a movie that has something to say about capitalism and greed, and about hopefully redemptive nature of convicts. Ethan Hawke has to take 3 more guys with him. It's a 4-man job. Once again, going back to the Sorcerer comparison. There's a shocking bridge sequence that is also not dissimilar to the bridge sequence in Sorcerer, where Ethan Hawke is forced to stand in the middle of the bridge and catch the gold bricks that are being thrown to him and throw them over to the other side of the bridge. It's a really cool sequence. There are a lot of really good action set pieces in this movie. The woman played by Julia Jones, who kind of inserts herself into the group. She ends up saving his life twice. There is a guy who is basically escorting them. His goal is to basically kill all of them and take all of the money for himself, along with his partner. It's just a fun, cool thriller, and Ethan Hawke and Russell Crowe are both having like a gravelly voice contest that is very fun and entertaining to watch. There's a beautiful bookend to this movie where Sam is driving his daughter around and they're kind of playing games on the road. Very eerie score, great sound design. This movie, the craft of this movie is just all really good and really solid. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what this director does next, because I think he's a pretty impressive new voice. The next thing I watched was a movie called Burn, directed by Makoto Nagahisa, starring Nana Mori. This was, without a doubt, the most punishing watch of the festival. This is a very, very dark movie. At the same time, darkly comic, but it's a deeply upsetting drama about a group of troubled youths who are kind of adrift on a sea of trauma and trying to learn to live in a world that seems to reject them and want to have nothing to do with them. The main character, Juju, played by Nana Mori, is a runaway from abusive family life, and she falls in with this like ragtag band of kind of misfits, outsiders who they all have funny personality quirks and nicknames. They're living in this mostly deserted square in a city called Kabuchiko in Japan. The gang is kind of loosely led by this character Kami, who is a sort of Peter Pan figure to these kind of lost boys and girls, but ultimately he's exposing them to a very dark underworld of sex and drugs. And this movie deals with a lot of really heavy themes, and it's at times just not fun to watch. I mean, you're just kind of forced to watch some things happen in this movie that are extremely unpleasant. But all of that is by design. That is the intention of the film. And I think the filmmaking in this movie is actually kind of extraordinary. There are a few visual tricks and techniques that this director pulls off that I'd never really seen before. There's a kind of VFX heavy sequence that sort of goes throughout the movie of where the camera kind of pulls back and extrapolates a full kind of like 3D rendering of the image that you're seeing of the scene you're watching, but the edges of the frame are kind of burn, and this is used like more and more throughout the film to kind of emphasize like how dangerous these things are getting, especially for Juju and her little kind of world, her little community that she's found. It's a very claustrophobic movie, and really just like fries your nerves for most of it. And then there is like a very kind of hallucinatory sort of dream, sort of potentially afterlife sequence that kind of ends the film. And then after all of this, the film ends, and then you get these very bright, colorful credits with this really bouncy, energetic J-pop music. So there's a really interesting balancing of tones throughout this movie, and by the end of it, I just didn't really know exactly what I had seen. So I don't even really know how to rate this movie. Other than that, I was really impressed with the filmmaking and the performances, but the content of it was very tough to swallow. The next film I saw was called Troublemaker, which is a documentary about the life of Nelson Mandela. This is directed by Antoine Fuqua. I had high hopes going into this movie. And then when I sat down and started watching it, I was pretty disturbed because there was a very heavy use of AI in this documentary. And for people who are always like wondering if they will ever be able to spot AI or if they can tell the difference, let me say, when you see it on a big screen in a theater, you can tell, especially if you have a trained eye, if you see these things, if you're seeking them out online. Look, everyone who knows me and knows this channel knows my stance on generative AI. I'm 100% totally against it, especially when it comes to, dispensing of jobs that could be done by a human being. Basically, Antoine Fuqua is using generative AI, especially in the early part of this documentary. There's not much of it towards the last half or the end, because what he's trying to do is create a portrait of Nelson Mandela's life basically from his childhood. And, he was born at a time in a place where photography and especially film cameras were not readily available. So he's fabricating these photos and footage of Mandela's early life, and also using AI to like smooth out the actual existing footage and reshape it and recolor it. I can't objectively state my thoughts on the film because this use of AI was so distracting and so annoying and nauseating and just completely unnecessary. It's just completely unnecessary. There are a lot of really interesting animated sequences in this movie, which they could have just continued using the animated sequences to tell that part of the story if they didn't have real footage. But once it finally catches up to the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and we do start seeing actual footage and photos from Mandela's life. It is incredibly insightful. It's a very important story. I have not personally read Mandela's autobiography, but it is heavily based on the accounts he gives in that book. Look, it's a very important story, and this was a documentary that I was looking forward to because I know about Nelson Mandela, but I don't know a lot of the details of his life. I just think the use of AI in this movie really tarnished my viewing experience of it. I am curious as to why Antoine Fuqua felt he had to resort to this in order to tell this story. The presentation of the documentary is just not something that I agree with at all whatsoever. So this was a huge disappointment for me. The next thing I saw was another documentary that was not disappointing at all. It was actually my favorite documentary that I saw at the festival. It's called To Hold a Mountain. This is directed by Biljana Tutorov and Peter Glomazik. I am probably butchering those names. Sorry about that. But this is a movie that really, every once in a while, a movie comes along and it restores your faith in humanity and in the endurance of humanity. And this is one of those movies. It basically shows us a life that is far away from this capitalist hellscape we inhabit here in America today. In Montenegro, in the mountains, and it's just a portrait of this gorgeous abundance of life that is being lived there in these remote mountains. It's a story that's centered on a small rural community. They raise animals, they raise sheep and cows, cats and dogs and chickens and every animal under the sun, and they're all allowed to roam freely among these like mineral rich mountains. And it centers on a woman and her daughter, really her niece. But we come to learn that this woman, Gara, has adopted this young girl, Nada, because her mother was actually murdered by her father when Nada was an infant. And her aunt, Gara, adopted her, essentially, and they live together. They even share a bed. They live in a very small hut nestled in these mountains. And we see them going about their life, doing their chores every day, milking cows and making cheese and baking bread and using buckets to bathe with, cooking on a wood fire stove. It is a very old traditional way of life. And the engine of this documentary is that their way of life is being encroached upon because the mountain where they live is being sized up by NATO for a military training grounds. They're going to use this mountain as a shooting range. The documentary basically follows Gara, the aunt mother character, who has basically pledged her life to protecting this mountain and keeping these NATO interlopers out. You know, we follow her as the military is zooming overhead with helicopters, looking to scout out areas for their training ground. She is rallying the community and rallying the people of the mountain to stand up and fight this, and they will not leave. They're not going to leave. She goes on a national television program to talk to some of these military officials, and she offers them cheese and hospitality, and you know, she is fighting with every breath in her body to maintain this way of life. And throughout the film, we see the joys of this way of life as well as the hardships. There's a very memorable, very tense and emotional sequence where the pair have to travel to rescue an injured calf. And it's a sequence that is as pulse pounding as any thriller you will watch. But I just thought this was a really lovely movie. It obviously has this sinister kind of undercurrent when you learn what has happened to Nada's parents and why her navigating girlhood and going to school and making friends and hanging out and, you know, finding kind of little pockets of modernity in the midst of their very pastoral life. I just thought it was a really moving, very powerful movie. And the family, the group, the community of Montenegro there, they actually win in the end, which is just nice to see at the end of a movie like this. So I definitely recommend To Hold a Mountain. The very last thing I saw at the festival, which, you know, I'm realizing now, I only watched 14 movies. Those are kind of rookie numbers. I had really hoped to see more movies than that. It's much less than I saw in Toronto. But again, the situation with my pass, it prevented me from seeing a lot of the stuff that I wanted to see. Anyway, the last thing I caught, which I ultimately did not finish, is a movie called The Shitheads. This is directed by Macon Blair, a director I really admire and have a lot of fondness for. And it stars Dave Franco and O'Shea Jackson Jr. and Kiernan Shipka. This is basically like a film that I covered on my podcast, The Last Detail. It's basically like taking that framework of the story, updating it to a modern day. Instead of transporting a member of the military, they are transporting this kid to rehab, and the kid turns out to be just psychotically evil and vain, and he's like an internet celebrity. Look, I wanted to like this movie. The audience was going crazy for this movie. I was sitting next to a woman who was laughing so hard and so frequently, and also talking to herself as she was laughing and talking to the screen as she was laughing, that I missed a pretty big chunk of dialogue for this movie. And really, I just think it's kind of like gross humor, kind of like silly, bottom of the barrel humor. I had a few chuckles, but ultimately my experience of watching this with these people, especially with the woman who was next to me, it just was not a good one. And so I did not finish the film. I walked out. This is the only film at Sundance that I walked out of after about an hour and some change. There was only, I think, 20 minutes left of the movie, but I was not having a good time because I couldn't understand what movie I was watching and what movie the rest of the audience was watching. I think this is a really, really weak showing for Macon Blair. He is so much better than this movie, and I know he was dealing with some issues getting The Toxic Avenger made and released over the last several years. He is a Sundance favorite. His film won the Sundance Grand Jury Prize in 2017, so he's kind of one of the indie heroes of the festival, and I was really looking forward to this new film. I just didn't find it very entertaining or interesting, really. It was really gross and and just like kind of silly. Not that I don't like silly movies, I do, but I am so used to seeing a much more nuanced kind of adult approach from Macon Blair, although his Toxic Avenger movie was quite silly, but that's one that I enjoyed because of the absurdity of it. And this film, I didn't finish it because I wasn't enjoying it. So that was the end of my Sundance experience. All in all, I had a pretty good time. I met a lot of really cool people at Sundance. I ran into some people who I'm a fan of. I ran into some fans of my show, which was really cool. I connected with some people in the Fiverr line that I was waiting with. I was seeing a lot of the same people in virtually every screening because we were all in that 5-minute line just waiting to see what we could get into. So I talked with a lot of them, people from all over the country. I ran into some kid in the Fresh Market who thought I was some famous TikToker. He ended up talking to me for a while. So it was a very productive trip for me. And I didn't really, have the glamorous experience that I had at TIFF, where I saw a lot of premieres and saw a lot of celebrities. I did walk past David Duchovny, very close by him at one point, and my God, he's one of the most handsome men I have ever seen in my life. I also walked past Tatiana Maslany at one point, but she looked like she was, on a mission, so I didn't stop her. Anyway, it was a fun time. I'm glad I got to be there the last year at Park City, although there was a melancholy in the air. And obviously with what happened in Minneapolis that transpired while I was at the festival was very distressing and cast a nasty pallor over the events. So I felt like I couldn't fully engage with the festival as much as I wanted to or thought I was going to. But all that to say, that was my Sundance experience. It might be my last Sundance experience. I have this hat and this hoodie to prove it. If you want to read my full reviews on all of these films, I publish them on my Patreon, where you can subscribe for just $3 a month if you want to help me out, or you can become a free member and you'll get access to certain things there. If you have not done so already, please subscribe to my channel and check out my recent videos, the 25 best films of 2025 as voted on by yours truly, as well as my immediate gut reactions to the Oscars nominations, who I predict and pick to win there. I will have another Oscars video that will be coming out right before the ceremony in March, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, happy viewing.